So not too long ago, I made a video where I sort of casually went over the history of Xbox throughout the gaming generations, and I talked about the numerous mistakes and lucky breaks that got them to where they are today, and that video actually ended up doing way better than I expected for a small channel like mine. Oh, and since this is a part 2, you should probably go watch that video first to understand the context, so there'll be a link in the cards and the description to go check it out. Now, to be fair, most people seem to actually agree with pretty much most of what I said. It's sitting at a pretty generous like-to-dislike ratio, no doubt in part due to the recent decisions made by the Xbox team over the last few months, but as I suspected, there are still quite a few dissenting opinions. And there's nothing wrong with that, of course. After all, there is a reason why I say that I love to continue the conversation in the comments. I don't just say it because I like alliteration, although that certainly helps. But I do think that it is worth making a second video, both to address some of those criticisms, as well as to flesh out some of the points that I was making, as I do think that some of what I said was either not communicated very well, or maybe not quite as fully researched as it maybe should have been. I also just want to say real quick that I won't be naming any specific commenters. I don't want to make it look like I'm trying to call people out or anything, so I'll just be going over generalized ideas that people have been saying. So, to start out with one of the sillier responses that I got, I think that one of the funniest things to come out of this is people just accusing me of being a Sony fanboy. For the record, I didn't really even touch a PlayStation until the PS4. I grew up with mostly Nintendo consoles, so at least get it right. I'm a Nintendo fanboy, not a Sony one. But seriously, I do want to make this clear. Just because I'm criticizing Xbox and Microsoft heavily, that doesn't mean that I'm saying that everyone else can do no wrong. Pretty much every major gaming company has been making really boneheaded decisions for decades. Sony's whole ongoing saga with their PC ports requiring a PlayStation Network connection is something that was so dumb I wrote up basically a whole essay about it in the community notes. And despite growing up with Nintendo, that doesn't mean that I can't acknowledge how out of date they can be when it comes to things like online services, or netcode, or the handling of emulation and fan games, or how they don't highlight developers very well on their storefront and at directs at times. And Capcom is one of my favorite third-party developers, and I really wish that they would stop doing stupid things like shoving microtransactions into single-player games. But the reason why I wanted to single out Xbox in particular is because I think that they are kind of a unique case in the gaming industry, where they seemingly lack core fundamentals when it comes to managing game development itself. They've made a lot of very concerning decisions throughout their entire history that seemingly suggests a complete lack of understanding of the games industry, and I do still legitimately think that they've only made it as far as they have thanks to a lot of luck and circumstance more than the actual decisions that they've made. Like, for as stupid as Nintendo can be at times, at least they still know how to make a good video game. Also, to touch on another minor point that I've seen some people make in the comments, I am legitimately surprised to see people coming out of the woodwork to defend the Duke controller. I know it's just anecdotal, but I swear growing up I never saw anyone who liked this thing. Every time I held it in my hands I hated it, all of my friends said they hated it, anyone I talked to at school hated it, and when I started chatting on forums, people there hated it. I know that this video is obviously going to have a very skewed sample size given the topic at hand, but yeah, I'm just surprised to see people defend it. And yeah, honestly, I mean, more power to you. I'm not about to sit here and say that you're objectively wrong for liking this controller. If it worked for you, then it worked for you, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I do think that the fact that they released the Type S controller that was a lot slimmer in design only a couple of years into the console's life cycle, and then that went on to replace the Duke entirely and become the default controller that moving forward, that probably says a lot about the criticism that the Duke had even back in the day. Doesn't mean you can't still like it, but I think it's pretty clear that a lot of people really didn't like it at the time either. But yeah, to get back to talking about the actual original Xbox itself, one of the biggest things that people kept reiterating about this part of the video in the comments is that the reason why the Xbox didn't have DVD support out of the box is because they would have had to have paid a media license to include it. So by making it into a separate purchase, they essentially put the cost of that dongle and had that cover the cost of that licensing fee in order to keep the base cost of the console down. Meanwhile, from what I can find, Sony helped at least in part develop the actual DVD format itself, so while I don't have any exact behind-the-scenes numbers, I assume that they likely didn't have to pay as much to implement it into their console, which is probably why the PS2 was also one of the cheapest DVD players of the time. And that's honestly fair. Sony really did just have a huge advantage purely from that alone, giving them a huge step up over their competition. Though, to go on a bit of a tangent, I have to wonder if this caused a sort of domino effect that made Microsoft get a skewed impression of how important the console's multimedia features are. I mean, if you think about it, looking back at Xbox's history as a whole, they got into the market when the PS2 had a built-in DVD support, and that rocketed them to first place in the market. Then, in the 360 generation, you may recall that Xbox tried to do something similar with HD DVD being built into their console. Meanwhile, Sony was pushing Blu-ray technology with the PS3. But despite the early lead in console sales, Microsoft still lost that format war too, as most people don't even remember that HD DVD exists anymore. So when it came to the Xbox One, they basically doubled down super hard on trying to turn their console into a multimedia hub, once again seemingly grossly overestimating the value of these non-gaming features. Because, like, yeah, back in the year 2000, the PS2's DVD compatibility was great and a huge selling point for the time, but by 2013, most people had, like, a laptop or whatever that could probably play all the media that they could ever want. Especially with streaming services being on the rise and only growing in popularity, many people already had plenty of means of playing Netflix or whatever on their TVs, so it's not like they needed it in their Xbox too. And as a result, Xbox certainly did not need to waste hours of press conferences and marketing budget trying to focus on these extraneous features either. It just made people think that Xbox was practically abandoning the gaming side of their consoles at times. But I have to wonder if they did that because of how they were scorned by Sony. Sony beat them on the multimedia front 2 times in a row with the PS2 and the PS3 right before the Xbox One generation, which I just kind of find interesting to think about. It's entirely possible that the PS2's DVD compatibility may have actually caused a domino effect of bad decisions on Microsoft's part that eventually had a massive impact on the brand as a whole by the time they got around to making the Xbox One. But to get back on track, to be honest, my criticisms of the original Xbox were really less about the hardware itself. I mean, hell, I even praised the hardware a bit in my original video. At the end of the day, it was still a powerful console for its price at the time, and Microsoft did make a legitimately good decision in essentially turning it into a PC in a box, which just made it a lot easier to develop for if you were already making games on PC. And that's why the Xbox got so many PC games on it, like Morrowind and KOTOR. Not to mention that focusing on things like LAN and online play, which were previously things that you could really only get on PC, was also pretty forward-thinking in retrospect. I'm not denying that they made some decently good hardware. And I mean, honestly, just looking at the Xbox brand as a whole again, the only time their problems were really hardware-related was with the whole Red Ring of Death saga. Even the Xbox One's problems really didn't have anything to do with the hardware of the console itself. It was all of the boneheaded decisions around that hardware, like including the Kinect 2 in the box and the always online DRM nonsense that doomed that console. In fact, I think I can pretty confidently say that Xbox at least knows how to make a piece of hardware that is at the very least serviceable for what it needs to do. It's just that the decisions that they make and how to utilize that hardware tend to be where they lose me, and I think that that's a good excuse to talk about the game situation again. So yeah, in my original video, I basically discovered that Microsoft had a lot less to do with the development of Halo than I originally assumed. And I came to the conclusion that without Halo being the mega hit that it was, the Xbox would have absolutely not gone on to succeed as well as it did. And furthermore, the fact that Halo ended up being an Xbox launch title in the first place was really down to more luck and circumstance than anything else. To sort of go into a little bit more detail about what I was talking about, Bungie was really only in financial troubles to begin with due to a very expensive bug in a prior game, Myth 2, that caused a major recall, since back then you couldn't just roll out an update to fix everything. And by the way, if you're curious, the bug was that if you uninstalled the game, it would literally wipe your entire C drive. So yeah, it was kind of a big deal for the time. It didn't put the company into complete financial ruin, but according to various people from Bungie at the time, it did put a lot more uncertainty into their future that made the idea of a buyout a lot more appealing for them than it would have otherwise. But even then, they still had plenty of offers from different companies. I mean, like I said in the first video, Halo was actually originally shown off at Macworld, and there's a real possibility that we could have had Bungie get bought out by Apple or any number of other companies like Activision and whoever else was making offers to them at the time. And furthermore, according to this interview that I found about the development of Halo, Ed Freeze, the former head of Microsoft Game Studios of the time, basically mentioned that it was his job to just find games to put onto this console that they were making. And the way that they talk about it, I think, is kind of revealing. Like, it seems like Microsoft started making a console with seemingly no real plan for what games were even going to be on it. Their plan was seemingly to just make a box and then buy the rights to a few games to slap onto it and hope that it worked out, with seemingly no real plan to make anything themselves. Some people also tried to claim on the last video that Xbox clearly knew how big the FPS genre was going to be, so of course they ended up buying Bungie and making Halo. But according to this interview, this guy straight up admits that at the time, nobody knew what was going to be successful. They were just working on trying to get dozens of different games and studios on board for their new console across many different genres. They were actually hedging their bets mostly on things like movie tie-in games, and many of the projects that they invested in never ended up seeing the light of day. It seems to me that they were clearly just throwing money at the wall to see what stuck. Hell, even in the official Microsoft documentary that they made, they even pointed out that the idea of launching a first-person shooter on a console instead of a PC was kind of a long-shot idea in the first place. Like, I really cannot help but think that the fact that Halo ended up being an Xbox launch title and that it succeeded as well as it did was basically a miracle for Microsoft. And yeah, there were other games on Xbox, of course, don't get me wrong. A lot of people took my dismissal of games like Fable as me trying to downplay how good those games were, or to make them invalid in some way. But my point wasn't about the quality of the games on the console or how many there were. I was specifically talking about brand power, as well as how it would have affected the launch of the console. Just because you specifically might have bought an Xbox at some point just to play Fable, doesn't mean that enough people would have done so to save the console without Halo. Like I said, Halo was the face of Microsoft. They really couldn't have asked for a better game to help establish themselves in the market and give them some kind of identity. So when I criticize games like Fable or whatever, I'm not saying that it's a bad game, or that there aren't people that bought an Xbox just to play Fable and not Halo. But I think that there's no way that a game like Fable could have possibly carried the entire Xbox brand on its shoulders like Halo did. And that's of course ignoring the fact that it wasn't even a launch title. And like, if we look at the list of best-selling Xbox games as a whole, a lot of these games are third-party titles that came out on other platforms like the PS2 or the PC at or around the same time as they were released on Xbox. Like, obviously you got Halo, Halo 2, and Fable as Microsoft-published games pretty much topping the list, and that's all great. But other than that, you have games like Grand Theft Auto, Splinter Cell, KOTOR, and so on, and like, again, these are all great games that you could have bought an Xbox for, but they're also games that came out on other platforms immediately or within a few months. There's no way that they would have been able to make them the face of the company like Halo was. Fable is, I think, the only other game that even had a shot at doing that, but since it didn't come out until 2004, there's no way it would have been able to do well without Halo leading the charge to get Microsoft's foot in the door. And to kind of prove what I mean, just look at a game like Mario Kart 8. For those of you who are unaware, Mario Kart 8 is actually the 6th best-selling game of all time. Not Nintendo game, any game anywhere. And it has over 70 million units sold. If there was ever a game that could turn around a console that had a bad launch, it would be Mario Kart 8. Except that that's exactly what didn't happen, because the game originally came out on the Wii U, and the Wii U was a console that had an absolutely terrible launch because Nintendo practically didn't put out any major first-party releases in its launch window. Sure, there were some other issues like poor marketing and whatnot, but I think that a factor that many people forget about is the fact that the only Nintendo games that launched with the Wii U were Nintendo Land, which is a fine demo but not much more than that, and New Super Mario Bros. U, which again isn't bad, but people were already getting tired of that series given that it was the 4th entry in as many years. So, despite Mario Kart 8 clearly having the potential to be one of the best-selling games of all time, It just wasn't enough to turn around a dying console like the Wii U, and it only managed to see success on the Switch, which of course ended up selling way better at launch, no doubt in part due to the fact that it launched with Breath of the Wild to help units fly off the shelves. So if Mario Kart 8, one of the best-selling games of all time, I must reiterate, wasn't able to save a dying Wii U, I don't think that in a parallel world without Halo, that a game like Fable would have been able to save a dying Xbox. And ultimately, that's why I'm so astonished that Microsoft didn't actually have a bigger hand with the development of Halo. It practically fell into their laps and went on to carry their entire gaming division on its shoulders for a decade straight. And I highly doubt that Microsoft would have been able to find something to take Halo's place had that not happened. And without the killer app, Microsoft themselves admits that they probably wouldn't have made it to the 360 generation. So if you still disagree with me that Halo is the only reason the OG Xbox survived, I think you need to take that up with Microsoft, because they actually agree with me on this one. Now, to move on to the 360, I already touched on this generation a little with my Format Wars talk, but something that some people brought up in the comments that I don't think a lot of other people realize, including myself at first, is that by the end of the 7th generation of consoles, the 360 actually ended up coming in 3rd place. Like, I fully agree with all of the people talking about how the 360 was the absolute peak for Xbox. It had tons of great games, the controller was really nice, they got tons of support from third-party devs, and so on and so forth. And yet, Xbox's peak in the gaming space was still 3rd place. And like, really think about that for a minute. As I said in the last video, they had just about every advantage that you could conceive of going into this generation. By this point, they had figured out their branding and identity and were riding high off of their success with the popular Xbox titles like Halo. The 360 launched a full year before the PS3 and the Wii, and since the Wii was so weak in power and the PS3 was so expensive and hard to develop for, they left a wide open hole in the market for the 360 to just kind of slip right on in and succeed. And like, that's also why the 360 had so many third-party games on it. Like, yeah, Microsoft did continue to use PC parts to make it easier to develop for, but that was compounded by the fact that their competition was actively making their consoles harder to develop for. They went from having a pretty good library to a really good library, primarily because of how the industry propped them up at the time. Like, yeah, I'm not denying that the early 360 era was great and that they got tons of games, but that was at least in part due to the circumstances completely beyond their control. And yet, despite all of these advantages, the 360 still ended up selling worse than the PS3 by the end of the generation. So how the hell did that happen? Well, as I went into more detail with my recent Kinect video, I think they got super jealous from the success of the Wii and were desperate to try and copy their homework, but the Kinect was just a fundamentally poorly conceived product that they ended up going way too hard on to try and make it work. On top of this, the latter half of the generation was when we started to see a decline in some Xbox staples. Famously, this was when Bungie parted ways with Microsoft, leaving them to try and figure out how to make Halo games without the original developers. And I think that it's hardly controversial to say that this is when Halo started to take a decline, and we saw similar things in other franchises that they were publishing, like Fable. Meanwhile, Sony got their act together in the latter half of the generation. They also had a motion control system, but they didn't go nearly as hard on it as Microsoft did, and thanks to a good console revision, some price drops, and a few standout titles being released like Uncharted 2 and the like, they really managed to turn things around and pick up the slack, and eventually passed the 360 in sales by the end of the generation. It really shows the difference between when a company is managed well and realizes the mistakes they've made versus one that is managed poorly. Like I said, Microsoft had every advantage going into this race, and they let that opportunity slip through their fingers. If the race had started out on more even footing, I think that Microsoft would have just been demolished by their competition. Finally, I do think that I have a few more things to say about the more modern Xbox eras. There were a few comments talking about how the Xbox One really wasn't as bad as I was making it out to be. Hell, a few accused me of spreading misinformation because many of the problematic issues I brought up, like the always online DRM and even the Kinect 2 requirement, weren't present in the Xbox One that they bought. And like, yeah, that is technically true, but that doesn't change the fact that they meant to include those god-awful features. Like, seriously, I guess it is now over a decade decade old, and I don't want to think about that for too long, but that 2013 Xbox E3 conference really is something to behold. While it is true that they did walk back most of the awful things that they talked about there, the fact that they were even trying to implement those features just kind of shows how incompetent the Xbox leadership was at the time. They thought that not only would people accept these terrible ideas, like the inability to use used games or being forced to buy the Kinect 2, but they were so proud of these ideas that they actively showed them off at E3 like they were expecting applause for them, which just means the Xbox leadership clearly had a complete disconnect with what their customers wanted at the time. So even though they did eventually respond to the negative feedback and remove almost all of these problems, that doesn't change the fact that leadership clearly had no idea what they were doing, and as a result, a lot of people lost faith in the brand. Their game started to go on a decline since clearly they had no idea how to actually help out their developers, and people just didn't trust them anymore after that press conference. I mean, hell, if you ever heard that please drink verification can green text meme, that was created in a direct response to the 2013 showcase. That's how bad things were. But yeah, like, yes, the console itself was technically fine. It was a box that played video games with an X on it. Both consumers and developers just didn't want to touch it though, because by that point, other companies like Sony were getting a lot better at helping smooth things over with developers. So Xbox lost their biggest advantage of being the easiest console to develop on, and that combined with the death of their public image basically ruined all hope of the console succeeding. And with Halo on the decline, and things like Fable having already gotten shut down, among other problems like that, their first-party titles were just not drawing in people anymore, and their third-party titles saw more and more releases on other platforms that were just as good. I recall this era being heavily defined by Xbox often buying temporary exclusivity deals, where like some third-party game would technically launch on Xbox first so that they could call it exclusive, but then it would come out on other platforms like the PS4 or the PC only like a month later, which to me just feels like a desperate bid for relevance. Like I said, sure, technically the hardware was fine, but the issue was and has always been that Xbox made a long series of terrible decisions that ruined any chance of that hardware doing well. And finally, a few people brought up some interesting points in regards to the current Xbox generation, which is that Xbox has actually kind of done a complete 180 in terms of being developer friendly. Like I said, their biggest advantage in the OG and 360 era was that their consoles were easier to develop on than their competition. But now the opposite is kind of true due to their whole Series X/Series S double unit thing that they have going on. Like, on paper, the Series S seems like a pretty solid idea. It's a much cheaper unit, plus it's digital only, which only saves them even more money, and especially when combined with Game Pass, it is pretty much the cheapest way to get into gaming as a whole. But I think that now, looking back on it in retrospect, the Series S has actually done way more harm for Xbox than good. You see, in order to try and make it seem, not inferior to the Series X, the Xbox requires that all games have complete feature parity on both consoles. You can't release a game on Series X unless it runs just as well with all the same features on the Series S. But since the Series S is so much weaker by comparison, that means that they kind of have the same problem of getting third-party developers that the Wii did back in the day. So as a result, you have games like Baldur's Gate 3 having to get delayed for months and months before it finally sees an Xbox release because they have to try and get it running on the Series S first before they can release it on the Series X. And ironically enough, it's not like they could just drop support from it, because from what I can find, the Series S has actually outsold the X by like a 2-to-1 ratio. After all, it is cheaper and easier to manufacture, so that kind of checks out. But even when we're talking about the more powerful Series X, things still don't look good for Xbox. There was this great Digital Foundry article that came out while I was scripting this video that goes into a lot more detail on this. Link in the description if you want to check it out for yourself. But basically, despite having the more powerful components on paper, games have mostly performed about the same, if not worse, on the Xbox when compared to the PS5. PS5. They break down a few theories about this, but a few notable points are things like how developers themselves say that the PS5 GPU is just easier to work with and gives devs more access to get more out of the hardware. Not to mention that developers are more free to slightly overclock certain components in the PS5 to help it overperform a bit. So all of this combined with the issue of having to also make a version for the Series S for every Xbox game just makes the Xbox the harder console to develop for, which I think just goes to show that even if they did intentionally make their older consoles easier to develop for in the past, they've clearly lost sight of that, and now they're practically limping down the track trying to maintain some level of relevance in the current generation. And of course, let's talk about Game Pass. Can I talk about Game Pass? We've got to talk about Game Pass some more. One of the weirder comments that I kept getting from people was that allegedly there is no $10 subscription tier for Game Pass anymore. And like, I don't know what to say in response to this other than, you're wrong? Like, I have Game Pass, I pay $10 a month for it. You can check this for yourself with literally 5 seconds of Googling. It's on their website. Okay, editing Blaze here to interject for just a minute. Amusingly enough, pretty much right after I finished recording, Microsoft actually announced that they're updating the pricing structure for Game Pass. So, congratulations, I guess, because now those comments from a few months ago will soon be retroactively correct. At the same time, I do feel like, though, that this only further proves my point, though, about Game Pass clearly not being as profitable and sustainable as Microsoft would like it to be. They're raising prices across the board and even introducing a new Game Pass tier that, in fact, does not include day one releases anymore, which is kind of a big deal, as that's sort of one of the main selling points of the service. And from what I could find, this is all set to go into effect around September, which is coincidentally right before the new Call of Duty will launch on the platform in October. And yeah, that just makes a lot of sense to me. A big criticism I've seen casually tossed Microsoft's way that I was kind of alluding to earlier, and I've also even seen it in my own comment section, is this idea that Microsoft has essentially spent like $70 billion buying Call of Duty, as well as a few other things that Activision owned, just to give it away on Game Pass, which just never quite seemed like a wise business decision. A lot of people were predicting that they might try to come up with some excuse to not release it on day one, or, have some kind of extra charge for it, or make some kind of exception, and, well, now here we are. Although I do still think that it is kinda super weird that the worst version of Game Pass is still the one on their consoles. Like, the PC version of Game Pass is only getting a $2 price increase and is still going to get all the new games day one. Meanwhile, console players will be getting the new standard tier, which still costs $3 more than it does on PC, but doesn't include day one games. So if you buy an Xbox, you will actively be getting a worse version of Game Pass unless you pay more for it, which that just feels like the opposite of how it should work to me. But anyways, let's get back to the main video and finish things up. Well, once again, we've pretty much caught up to the modern day, and I guess there isn't a whole lot else to talk about beyond speculating what they might do in the future. And, well, I'm not about to pretend like I have all the answers, but there's a few obvious things right off the bat that I would probably suggest Microsoft does. For one, they clearly need to talk to and actually understand what developers need out of their consoles and services. Famously, after the PS3 and all the issues it had with developers, Sony had a lot more people go out to talk to developers to get their opinions on things and be like, hey, what can we do to make your life easier? And really shifted their efforts in that direction. And it's clearly worked out well for them over the last couple of generations. Meanwhile, Xbox seemingly has just been buying developer after developer, hoping that merely owning the IP will magically make things work out for them. But the reality of the situation is that you still have to actually help out the developers that you buy sometimes. Rather famously, Microsoft has been rather hands-off with many of the developers it buys. And that can sound like a good thing, and in many cases it can be. After all, we hear way too many stories about how publishers keep screwing over developers with overreach and whatnot. But publishers do still have a job to do, and they can help make a game even better if they do their job right. Games like Anthem, or what have happens when a developer is waffling back and forth for too long without any meaningful outside intervention to help get them back on track. The few good things in that game can be directly attributed to their publisher going like, hey, why did you take out the flying system? That was actually fun, and things like that. Meanwhile, Microsoft is doing things like putting all their chips on games like Starfield, when I think that pretty much anyone with half a brain could have seen that that game wasn't going to be as successful as they wanted it to be, and then as a result they closed down studios like Arcane and Tango, who did absolutely nothing wrong and had a great potential to bring in lots of strong games to their platforms. Microsoft just doesn't seem to want to actually try and grow new IPs themselves like other companies do, such as Nintendo, Capcom, or even Sony. They just want to take shortcuts and buy out all the already popular IPs, and frankly, I don't think that that's a very good strategy. It sounds good on paper to have all these IPs under your belt, but a console needs more than just a big IP every once in a while. They need more niche, smaller titles and unique IPs to help flesh out a library to help appeal to more people. And when you build up an IP from scratch yourself, that also means that you hopefully have a better understanding of what makes it easier to maintain in the future. Something that Microsoft has struggled with specifically in the past, with games as big as Halo once their original developers left. But yeah, I might as well toss it back to you guys at this point. But as always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. If there's one big takeaway that I want to leave you guys with, it's that I'm by no means trying to say that people are somehow wrong for being an Xbox fan. As I've stated multiple times by now, there were clearly some legitimately good ideas that they had early on, like investing into online play before it became more commonplace. And even if there were a lot of things that they just sort of lucked into, like Halo, that doesn't make those things unenjoyable for people like you and me. Really, what I'm saying with all of this is that Xbox fans deserve better than what they're getting. The leadership in charge has just been letting you guys down for far too long, and it just hasn't been learning from both the mistakes that they've made in the past, as well as the lessons that they could be learning from their competition. It feels less and less over time like Xbox is a games company, and more like it's a company that happens to own a few big gaming IPs that they have no real actual idea how to manage. And I think that the people who have grown up with Xbox and Halo and Fable and all this good shit deserve better than this half-hearted and seemingly aimless treatment that they've been getting. But, like I said, feel free to chime in with your own thoughts in the comments down below, and if you liked what you saw, remember to leave me a like. If you want to see me make more videos like this in the future, then make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so that you can get notified of when I make those videos. And if you really want to help the channel out, then you can become a member on YouTube or donate to my Ko-Fi to help me keep doing what I'm doing. But for now, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.